All right, so we've got a bunch of people on and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. And a thank you to Subaru for sponsoring this whole day of amazing workshops. So some of you may have already been on for tips and tricks for training your dog and be amazed reading your dog's body language. And if you have a little bit of extra time this afternoon and want to join us for some of these other workshops, you can go ahead and sign up on our website. And all of these are free for everybody, but Berkeley Humane is a nonprofit, and if you have a great time today and want to give us a donation, we would love to receive that, again, at berkeleyhumane.org. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nancy Frensley, our head training manager, and she'll take it from here.
Okay, well, I'm here to introduce Dr. Clive Wynne. We are so pleased to have him today. He's a professor of psychology at Arizona State University. He's a founder of the Canine Science Collaboratory. Every year, the collaboratory presents a number of special conferences, and among them is our well-known and loved Bay Area Canine Science Symposium. Dr. Wynne has his most recent book, Dog is Love, which we highly recommend you read. It includes his and his group's research into how the dogs relate to us, and contrary to our beliefs about being anthropomorphic, how they really truly love us. Today, he's presenting What Makes Dogs Special, and there are highlights from Dog is Love. He shows us scientifically how our dogs are able to love us and become the very treasured family members that we do love in return. So we need you to save your questions and put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your page. And after the presentation, we will answer as many of your questions as we can. Dr. Wynne will answer them, actually. And thank you very much. I'm turning this over to Dr. Wynne. Dr. Clive. Dr. Clive, okay, we'll call you. And thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you for inviting me out to Berkeley Humane. I so wish I could be with you in person. I've heard so much about the Berkeley Humane Society, but I've never actually visited myself. But anyway, you know, life gives us lemons, and so we make lemonade. And for all that, I'm sure there are many others in this webinar who would like to be out of Berkeley as well. Still, this is a way that more of us can get together, and that's got to be a good thing. That's got to be a great thing. And yeah, so I want to talk to you for a little while this afternoon about what it is that makes dogs so special. And the answer is already on the first slide. It's actually, science can actually prove that your dog really loves you. And this is the theme of my book, Dog is Love. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of my journey, just a tiny bit of my journey to come to this realization, which maybe to you it sounds obvious, and to me in some sense it's obvious too. I mean, anybody who doesn't who isn't a scientist about this can easily see the affection that shines out of their dogs' bodies, but it was difficult for me for a variety of reasons, and I'm going to share that with you fairly briefly now this afternoon. So I'm not the first scientist to wonder about what it is that makes dogs special. And starting about 20 years ago, there was a movement among scientists who make dogs their special object of study to try and understand how come dogs are so successful, right? So if we were in a room together, we could do this as a Q&A, but in a Zoom world, it doesn't really work as a Q&A. So I'm just going to have to tell you the answers. Think about it. How many dogs do you think there are in the world? Well, there are probably something like 1 billion with a B dogs in the world. That's an astonishing number. No other large mammal, aside from ourselves, of course, gets anywhere close to that number of animals. How many wolves are there left in the world? Probably just a few tens of thousands. Tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the number of dogs. All of our dogs, by the way, are descended from wolves. Wolves are the ancestors of our dogs. And yet wolves are almost extinct. They are extinct in most parts of the world where they used to live. And yet dogs are so unbelievably successful. So what is the secret of dogs' success in the modern world? Obviously, it has something to do with us, it has something to do with their relationship with human beings. But what exactly? So about 20 years ago, a couple of scientists on different sides of the Atlantic quite independently suggested that there was something about the smarts of dogs, the intelligence of dogs, that give them this edge over other species. That dogs have evolved special ways of understanding people. Now, this has been, and for some people continues to be, an influential account of how dogs could be so successful. I don't believe it. I don't think that it's their intelligence that has made dogs such a successful species on our planet. And I say this even though I have met the dog that the BBC called the world's smartest dog. And that's this dog Chaser. And again, if we were in a room together, I could say, have you heard of Chaser? And I could get a sense how many of you have already heard of Chaser. Typically, in a room full of people interested in dogs, most people have already heard of this dog. Both the dog and the dog's master trainer are now deceased. Dog Chaser, and that's John Pilley. John Pilley was a retired psychology professor at Wofford College in South Carolina. He heard about some dogs in Europe that have been discovered to know the names of more than a couple of hundred objects. And so he decided, he got a dog pup. His wife recognized that he was rather bored in retirement, got him this border collie puppy, and he just made it a project to see how many names of objects could he teach this dog. And he kept going, training Chaser for about 3 hours a day, pretty much every day for over 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, he had solid evidence that Chaser knew the names of over 1,200 objects, 4 times more than any other dog that has ever been tested by scientists. As I say, I visited with Chaser and John Pilley about a decade ago now. I like to say I knew Chaser before she was famous. John Pilley and I had a mutual friend who put me in touch. And so I was able to visit with them. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that there was no cheating. This was the real McCoy. This dog really knew the names of all these objects. But I still don't think that it's intelligence that makes dogs exceptional. And in the case of Chaser, I'll just draw your attention to 2 facts. One is Chaser is exceptional. Most dogs don't know the names of more than a handful of objects. My own beloved Zephos, I don't think she knows more than 3 words. I honestly don't. I know, your dog's smarter than my dog, fair enough. Your dog maybe knows the names of 5 or 6 objects, but try getting your dog to learn more than that. It's very, very rare. So that's fact number 1, is that these are exceptional individuals. They're not typical of the species dog. And fact number 2 is that although the sheer number of objects that Chaser knew the names of is astonishing, the process by which she learned those names would have been familiar to Ivan Pavlov, the very first scientist to ever investigate the behavior of dogs over 100 years ago. Because if you train a dog on the name of an object, you're just establishing a sound as predicting an interesting consequence for the animal. You're teaching the animal an association. And we have known since Pavlov in the 1880s that dogs can learn associations. Learning associations is one of the most basic and primitive forms of learning that psychologists have been able to uncover. And associative learning has been found in every animal species that it has ever been looked for in. You get associative learning in sea slugs, for goodness sake. So the process that underlies this is a very basic process that you could find in any animal that you might try it in. Okay, so that I don't think that doesn't indicate to me that dogs have a special kind of intelligence. I'm not going to spend all afternoon giving you different kinds of intelligence that dogs might show because it would get boring, but I'll give you one other example that I love. I love sniffer dogs. I mean, a lot of us say, my dog saved my life. And we mean that in a metaphorical sense. We mean that we were unhappy, we were in a difficult place in our lives, and our dog showed sympathy and empathy, and that cheered us up, and we say, saved my life. But we don't really mean you wouldn't have been dead if the dog hadn't done that. And yet, back in the days when we used to travel, every day in every airport, dogs were literally saving our lives. Dogs that have been trained to sniff out hidden explosives were literally saving our lives all the time, sweeping through stadiums before major sporting events, sweeping through courts to make sure nothing had been smuggled in. Ahead of political rallies, dogs go through wherever the leading politician is going to give a speech. That space has to be swept by dogs that have been trained to sniff out hidden explosives, which is just amazing, right? Just wonderful. It's like magic. It's like magic to me because they see, or rather smell, something that's invisible to us. But again, the actual form of intelligence that the animal is using is quite basic, quite a basic form of intelligence. Again, it's associative learning. What's different about dogs is not that they're smarter than us, right? Why don't we train humans to go sniff out explosives? It's not that the humans couldn't understand it, it's that we can't smell it. Our noses, our human noses, are so poor, whereas dogs have excellent noses. But they don't get to be called intelligent because their noses are sensitive. You don't say that somebody is smarter than somebody else because they have sharper vision. So we won't say that dogs are particularly smart because they have sensitive noses. Okay. So two examples of intelligence in the general sense, which although I love these examples, I love Chaser and I love sniffer dogs, I don't think they're evidence of exceptional intelligence. In any case, the kind of intelligence that the scientists who advocated that there was something special about dog intelligence was an intelligence in understanding what people were doing. And there were a number of experiments that were done on this theme. The simplest one, the most widely used one, is so easy to do that you could easily try it on your own dogs when you get home. This photograph on the slide shows one of my past students, Monique Udell, now a professor at Oregon State University. She is simply pointing at a container on the floor. And any of you can try this with your own dogs. Just point at something on the floor and see whether your dog goes where you point. Most of you will find, most of the time, that your dog will indeed follow your pointing gestures to investigate what you might be pointing at. That may not strike you as very remarkable, but to the scientists 20 years ago who were developing these theories, it seemed important because they couldn't find chimpanzees who could do this, who would follow a human pointing gesture. They also tested some wolves and concluded that the wolves could not do this. And so from that, they concluded that this was a special skill in dogs, that dogs had a special capacity to understand human pointing gestures, and that this was part of dogs having developed special skills in understanding people. When I first heard about this, I thought this was a pretty plausible idea. I thought this could indeed be the case. But then one of the most exciting things that happened to me in my life in science, I got an invitation from an outfit in Indiana who have been hand rearing wolves since 1974. This is Wolf Park in Indiana, beautiful place, most beautifully hand-reared wolves you will ever come across. And so my students and I went out to Wolf Park and we carried out this same test on their hand-reared wolves. And in this picture, you see my past student, Lindsay Meerkam, now a professor at Monmouth University in New Jersey, and she is pointing at a container on the ground, and you can just about see the body of a wolf in the foreground corner of the picture, because here is the wolf. What's the wolf gonna do? Well, what we found was that the wolves at Wolf Park were every bit as ready to follow human pointing gestures as were the dogs living in people's homes. So, cut a long story short, there's nothing special about the intelligence of dogs. Anything a dog can do, anything. The crucial thing of paying attention to human actions and understanding human intentions as they're shown in, for example, gestures, wolves that have been carefully hand reared are just as good at that. So I cannot now remember exactly where I am in my life story, but this is what, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, that I reached this stage with my students where I convinced myself that there was nothing special about the intelligence of dogs. And it was around this time that there was a journalist traveling around the United States with his dog, and he was interviewing people who had something to say about dogs. And he came and he interviewed me. He seemed like a nice young man, seemed very friendly. You have to be careful when you're talking to journalists. And I told him my point of view. And then he wrote about me in his book. This is back when I was at the University of Florida before I moved to Arizona. And this is what he said about me in his book. He said, Florida's Canine Cognition and Behavior Lab was led at the time of my visit by psychologist Clive Wynne, a former pigeon researcher, considered by some to be the Debbie Downer of the canine cognition field. Well, you know, you don't get into science to win popularity contests. So I didn't mind being called the Debbie Downer. That's okay. That's okay. But at the same time, it sort of forced me to reconsider my position, because I love dogs. I've always loved dogs ever since I was a little kid. And I knew that there's something special about dogs. I was just disagreeing with some fellow scientists about what the nature of that thing that makes dogs special, what it might be. What is it that makes dogs special? They say intelligence. I say, no, it's not intelligence. But I realized by saying what it's not, without proposing any kind of an alternative, that I had created a situation, a sort of a vacuum, if you like, where it seemed like I was saying there isn't anything special about dogs. And so I realized I need to come up with an alternative theory. I need to have an alternative account of what it is that makes dogs special. Now, I don't know whether any of you have read my book. I don't know how it comes across to people. It sometimes seems to me that the way this played out is so cute that it might seem like I'm making it up. It might not seem like it's true, but this is honestly what happened. So for a long time, we hadn't had a dog, my wife and I. You know, there were a variety. We both had dogs before we met, but there were a variety of reasons why we hadn't had a dog since we'd been together. And, you know, we moved internationally and we weren't sure if we were going to stay in the United States. And we had a new baby and we weren't sure we could cope with the dog as well as a baby. Anyway, long story short, we reached a stage in our lives where we felt comfortable bringing a dog into our family. And so we acquired this dog, Zephos, who we called Zephos. And she immediately explained it to me, because even, you know, she's not a smart dog. Sorry, she can't hear me now. She's not a smart dog by the standards of dogs. But it was immediately apparent that there was something really remarkable about her. And that is this unbelievable radiating of love. She just so loved us and loves us. I mean, if you came and visited me, she would love you too. It's just like comes out of her, it radiates out of her, this capacity and desire to form loving relationships. And so this got me thinking. I mean, I sort of knew this. I've had dogs in my life before. I know how affectionate dogs are, but I'd never attempted to take that sort of everyday knowledge and move it into my scientific life. And so I'm thinking, how can we even express this? I mean, we never use the word love in scientific publications. How should we conceptualize this? How can we think about this? And so I began to investigate the possibility that dogs have special skills in forming relationships, that might be their special thing. And I'm here to tell you that I'm convinced from multiple levels of scientific analysis that this is indeed dogs' special skill. Okay. How can we investigate this? Well, there are two levels. One level is people loving dogs, and the other level is dogs loving people. Now, the first level is not something that my students and I have done a lot of research on, because we view ourselves as the dog researchers, dogs in human relationships, but still we focus on the dogs. But I do have one study that we've done on people loving dogs, and I enjoy talking about this study, so I want to share it with you. And it stems from stepping back for a moment and thinking about how dogs and people live together. Now, I already told you that I think there are up to 1 billion dogs on the surface of this planet. But of that billion dogs, only a minority live as pets inside people's homes. We don't have exact numbers for any of this, but there might be maybe 250 to 300 million pets living inside human homes on this planet. That leaves 600 million or more dogs who are not pets. Well, how do dogs who are not pets live? They do not primarily live as truly wild animals out in the forests or whatever, hunting prey like wolves do. That's extremely rare for dogs. The vast majority of the world's dogs live among human beings in cities, in towns, and particularly around the edges of cities and towns, and particularly around the trash dumps on the outskirts of cities and towns. And the majority of dogs do not hunt their own food, primarily. They scavenge. They find leavings that people are tired of, no longer see as valuable, but dogs still see a value in them. This photograph shows you a man with 4 street dogs in India. This man is Sunil Pal, who has published a series of wonderful scientific papers just observing and recording the behavior of the dogs on the streets of his town. His research is such high quality that he has won awards from international scientific societies for the quality of his research. He's actually a high school teacher. He's not a university professor. He's a high school teacher, but he's very talented and he studies these dogs. And one of the things that he observes among the dogs living in his community is that very few of the puppies survive to their first birthday. He observed 82% mortality, death of puppies in their first year of life. Similar results have been found in Italy, where there are also free-living dogs in the mountains of central Italy. Luigi Boitani and his colleagues have found an even higher death rate among puppies born in the mountains of central Italy. I haven't seen the dogs in either of those locations. I spent an afternoon in Nassau in the Bahamas going around the back streets, and there I saw many, many dogs living on the streets of Nassau in the Bahamas. And I was chatting there with a researcher, William Fielding, at the College of the Bahamas. He had not studied this in detail, but he shared the impression that the majority of dog pups born on the streets in Nassau do not make it to their first birthday. And it was William Fielding who placed in my mind this thought: what is it that the lucky ones have going for them? How do you get to be a dog who will survive to your first birthday? And Fielding suggested that what was crucial was that your mother, when she's sick of you, when she wants to wean you around 8 weeks of age, that she then dump you near a human home that is not already caring for a dog. Because, William said, and this ties in with many people's intuitions, puppies at 8 weeks of age are extremely attractive to human beings. Now, a long time ago, the Austrian Konrad Lorenz, one of the founders of the School of Ethology, he put forward an idea which he called, being a German speaker, he called it Kindchenschema, which is usually translated into English as something like baby features or infant schemata, that kind of thing. The idea being that there is something about the young of all species that appeals to us human beings and engages us in wanting to nurture and care for this young animal. Things like the young of all species tend to have bigger eyes proportional to the size of their face, bigger eyes, smaller noses, and smaller and especially sort of cute mouths. And Lorenz suggested that this Kindchenschema, this baby-featured face, engaged us human beings and made us want to care. This theory has been around for a long time. It's been supported in a number of studies. But I have often thought that actually there is that it's possible to be too young to be cute. I don't know how many of you are parents, But when your baby is newborn, he or she is not as cute as he or she will become in a few weeks or months. There is this phenomenon that newborn babies are kind of, can I say ugly? They're not as cute as babies become. And I've often thought the same thing about puppies, that newborn puppies, they don't do anything for me. And most people seem to agree that newborn puppies are not that cute, but they become cuter. And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to show people pictures of the heads of puppies from birth through 8 weeks and onwards to see whether there is any peak at a time, an age at which puppies are particularly attractive to human observers. And some years ago, I had a student, Nadine Chassini, now a veterinarian in the Netherlands, and she had friends who bred dogs of different breeds, and she was able to get photographs from 3 breeds of dog, Jack Russell, Cane Corso, and White Shepherd, starting at birth, every week for the first so many weeks, and then a little bit more spaced out in time every couple of weeks as they got older, out to 7 months. And we just show people these photographs one at a time on a computer screen, and we ask people, how cute is this pup? And they slide a slider from 0 to 100 to indicate to us how attractive they found that puppy. How cute is this pup? And so on and so on. 51 people did this. We had all these different photographs. At the end of the day, we end up with a graph like this. Along the bottom of the graph, we have the age of the puppy in the picture. And going up the graph, we have how the human observers rated the attractiveness. And you can see a couple of things. One of the things is you can see that my intuition turns out to be correct, that the newborns are not the cutest they could be. They will become cuter as they grow up, but that cuteness will peak. And in the case of the Jack Russell Terrier, it peaks. The mathematical function has a peak at 7.7 weeks, which is pretty much exactly when the mother is tired of them and is going to kick them out. And then as they get older still, their attractiveness declines. So that's very sweet. That matches exactly what I thought might be the case, that we humans are most attracted to dogs just at that point in their lives where our intervention could have the biggest impact on their survival. That is to say, around 8 weeks when their mother wants to kick them out. The Cane Corsos, the mathematical function peaks a little bit younger, but you can see that their maximum attractiveness is in this sort of 6, 7, 8 week range. Again, around when their mother is growing tired of them. And finally, the White Shepherds, it's a tiny bit longer, 8.3 weeks, but there's no real difference here. These are all at around the same age and precisely the age where their mothers are weary of them and are going to kick them out. So this now means that I can show you pictures of dog pups that science has demonstrated are the cutest that any puppy could possibly be. So brace yourselves, because I think you're going to feel something when these pictures go up. Okay, did you feel something? Did you feel a tug on your heartstrings? Those are the puppy photographs that science demonstrates are as attractive as a puppy could possibly be. These are the youngest ones. They were the least attractive on the younger side. They're all the earliest photographs that we were able to get hold of. And these are the least attractive on the older side. These are the oldest dogs in every case. Now, I mean, we all have different preferences. To my mind, some of these older dogs are still very handsome. But I think if you were to imagine, if you look up and down each column and you were to imagine being offered, you can have one of these 3, which one would you take? Then I think most people would indeed take the middle row. They are the most attractive. That said, if you were to adopt any of these puppies in the middle row, I think as they grow up and you build a relationship with them, you wouldn't kick them out just because they're no longer as cute as they were when they were 8 weeks old. I think the relationship develops, and a bond forms. It's not just about who looks cutest, right? It's about the relationship, the experiences that you have together, and the bond that you form together. So human attractiveness to dogs peaks just around weaning, when human intervention can have the biggest impact on their lives. So measuring how people feel about dogs is fairly straightforward, right? We just ask them. We say, do you like the look of this? Do you like the look of that? We can just ask our own species. We just ask each other questions. That's not so hard. How do we measure how dogs feel about people? That can be more challenging because the dogs are not going to straightforwardly tell us. But it's not beyond possibility. And it turned out that as I got to thinking about this, that a friend of ours had already shown us a very simple test that does this job very nicely. And this is Mariana Bentosela, who's a professor in Argentina, who came up to the United States to visit with us to learn from us about our techniques. But she also taught us one of her techniques, which I subsequently realized fitted what we needed here very, very well. All you do, you separate a person from their dog, or I'm also going to show you a human and a wolf who've been separated. They don't have to be separated for long. 10 minutes is plenty. Put the person on a chair, mark a 1 meter, that's about 3 feet, circle radius around the chair. Let the animal and the person into the same space and measure how long does the animal spend inside the circle. We just give them 2 minutes. We measure what portion of 2 minutes do they spend inside the circle. So on the left side of the screen, you see a wolf, a hand-reared wolf at Wolf Park, and a young woman, Dana Drenzik, who has known that wolf. They have known each other since the wolf was 10 days old. And you can see the wolf comes up to Dana. She's been asked to remain passive. She's allowed to touch the wolf if it touches her, but that's all. And on the right, you see the same experiment with a dog. I don't know the dog's name or the woman's name, but they are in the standard human-dog relationship that so many of us enjoy. So super simple test. We're just going to measure how much time the animal spends inside the circle as a way of measuring the strength of the bond between the person and the animal. When we measure this with the wolves, hand-reared wolves, they've known these people all their lives. They care about these people. They spend on average about a quarter of the interval inside the circle with the person. The same thing with dogs. On average, the dogs spend pretty much every single second of the 2-minute interval inside the circle with their person. Even though in the vast majority of cases, these dogs did not know the people as early in their lives as the wolf knew that person, and yet the dogs express much stronger, 4 times stronger interest in being with their person. So, I mean, we have other experiments, but one super simple test of how attracted a pet dog is towards their special person. Okay, so do dogs have special skills in forming relationships? Yes, they do, and it's not difficult to demonstrate. Now, can we show how this is embedded in their biological natures? If I want to claim that dogs are different from other animals, ultimately, this has to be embedded in their genetic code. The genetic code is the code, the instructions in which every biological being is written. But in practice, it's extremely difficult to find genes that code for behaviors. It's extremely difficult for at least 2 major reasons. One is that unlike hair color, or whether you go bald when you get older, unlike eye color, the genetics of behavior is very complicated. Usually there are many genes that contribute in different ways to behaviors. That's number one. And number two is that behavior, and the more complex the behavior, the more true this is, behavior is very dependent on life experiences. Obviously, you know that a dog that's been abused through its life is going to be much more tentative around people than a dog that's only ever had loving interactions with human beings. So your life experiences can have a very big impact on your patterns of behavior independent of your genes. So as I say, for at least those 2 reasons, it's very difficult to find genetic basis for behavior, but it's something we want to look for. A paper was published about 10 years ago now suggesting that dog evolution included changes in genes that in humans are involved in a very rare syndrome called Williams-Burron syndrome. Williams-Burron syndrome has a lot of impacts. It involves about 28 genes on one of our chromosomes that are deleted, completely wiped out. And because there are so many genes involved, Williams-Burron syndrome has a lot of different impacts on a human being who has this syndrome. people with Williams syndrome have strange facial structure, they have heart defects, they have supersensitive hearing, and they are unbelievably friendly. The medical literature says that they show excessive gregariousness, because of course, words like love and friendliness are too short and too easy to understand for medical journals. So they came up with this phrase, excessive gregariousness. Now, it was a young geneticist at UCLA, Bridget von Holt, who made this discovery. I already mentioned my past student, Monique Udell. Monique Udell and Bridget von Holt met at a conference and got talking about this discovery of Bridget's with the genetics. And they decided to collaborate on a study where where Monique would test the behavior of dogs and wolves, how sociable, how friendly they are. She then sent DNA samples, which is just a harmless mouth swab, to Bridget for analysis of the genes with a particular focus on the 28 genes that are involved in Williams-Buren syndrome. And now we can directly look and see whether any of these 28 genes can help us understand the difference in friendliness, in gregariousness between wolves and dogs. Cut a long story short, that's exactly what they found. We were able to identify 3 genes that, if they're damaged in humans, lead to Williams syndrome. 3 of the 28 Williams syndrome genes with these catchy names, WBSCR17, GTF2I, and GTF2I-RD1, those 3 genes account for the difference in friendliness, in gregariousness, in love between wolves and dogs. So it's difficult to come up with a picture of this. Genetics is just like massive white machines that look like washing machines but cost about 1,000 times more. So I've got this one illustration for you. What you see here is across the bottom of the graph is you have the 28 genes in the target part of the genome. And going up the graph, you have the relationship between the gene and the behavior. And so you can see at least 2 of the genes I was talking about pop out as having an important relationship with the behaviors that we're interested in. So to me, that's one of the most exciting discoveries I've been involved in, that we've actually been able to track down 3 genes that mutated in the journey from wolf to dog, and whose the changes help us understand and account for the exceptional gregariousness, the exceptional friendliness, the loving natures of dogs. We've actually found genes for love in dogs. Very quickly, I'll wrap up by sharing with you a few discoveries by other scientists around the world that also show different ways that love for people is programmed into the bodies of our dogs. A study from Australia, Mia Cobb and collaborators put heart rate monitors on dogs and on people. In this photograph, you see the heart rate monitor being strapped over the chest of the dog. This woman, she's got her top on so you can't see, but she also has a heart rate monitor strapped over her chest. You let her and her dog sit down together, and as they relax together, you find that their heartbeats actually become synchronized. So it's super cute. It's just like the song says, 2 hearts beating as one. So we see it in their heartbeats. This is the only photograph I have to try and illustrate a study from Japan, from Azabu University. They simply had people and their dogs sit down and look at each other. That's all they had to do. They also had the human fill in a questionnaire asking just how intense, how strong did they feel their relationship was with their dog. And before and after they did this, the person and the dog provided a urine sample so that the laboratory could analyze the levels of oxytocin in their bodies before and after they did this. Oxytocin is a hormone that is found to be elevated when people are in very strong, loving relationships. And what they found was that if on the questionnaire, the human said, yes, I have a very strong, loving relationship with my dog, if they then sat down and just made eye contact with their dog, the level of oxytocin on both sides went up. The human and the dog showed elevations in this love hormone. So dogs love in their genes, they love in their hearts, they love in their hormones. A fascinating series of studies that I won't attempt to tell you much about now, carried out by a group led by Gregory Burns at Emory University in Atlanta, they've trained dogs to lie perfectly still in these MRI scanners so that they can measure the dog's brain activity while they show the dog signals. First, they just trained the dog on a signal that means a piece of sausage is on its way. That was a hand held up. And a signal that means no sausage is on its way. That was two hands held together horizontally. And they were able to confirm that a particular center in the brain, the caudate nucleus, shows elevated activity when the dog is expecting a reward. Now, that wasn't too surprising because there have been many studies done on many species, and including our own, identifying that the caudate nucleus is an important brain reward center. But what's interesting is they went on from there, and they trained the dogs that one signal, which is this sort of child's car toy, one signal means your beloved human is just around the corner and will show up in a moment. And an alternative signal, which I wasn't able to find a photograph of, which was another toy, a very different looking toy, meant a piece of sausage is on its way. So now they're showing the dogs two different signals. One means human, one means sausage. And they look at how the dog's brain reward centers light up for one signal compared to the other signal. Then they let the dogs out into this big room where the dogs actually have a direct choice between their human, there you see the dog choosing its human, and on the other side, perhaps not apparent to you behind the screen, on the other side, same angles, same distances, is a bowl of food. Each dog was given 20 opportunities to make this choice, and they measured what proportion of the time did the dog choose the food compared to choosing their human. I love the expression on her face when she's not chosen on that trial. She finds that so funny. I think I would too. Okay, so we have two different ways of measuring the dog's relative interest in food versus people. And we're interested to see, do they stand in a relationship to each other? And so what I have here is a graph, and going up the graph, we're going to see how often the dog chooses the person given a free choice. And going across the graph, we're going to see how much the dog's brain lights up for the person compared to the food. And the first finding is that the majority of dogs are more interested in their human than they are in the food. So there are more of these points. Each point is a single dog. More of these points are in the top half than in the bottom half. More dogs care for the human than for the food. And the other point is that there's a strong relationship between these points. A dog like this one here really liked choosing their person, chose their person about 80% of the time. And when they were given the signals in the brain scanner, their brain lit up more intensely for the human than for the food. But on the other hand, a dog like this poor, sad, miserable dog down here, who never chose his human, also showed very little brain activation for the human compared to the food. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up. I'm going to wrap up in two ways. I'm going to wrap up with a small correction, but I think important. So I say dogs love people, but actually I need to correct myself. It is not the case. I don't want to send you home thinking that dogs evolved to love people, because what we know is that dogs actually evolved to love anything. Anything that a dog meets during its first 3 months of life, it will then go through the rest of its life looking to find other beings like that one to form emotional bonds with. In our lives, obviously our dogs meet people in the first 3 months of life. Of course they do. It couldn't be otherwise. But if you want your dog to take care of goats on your ranch, as David and Catherine Henniger did, this is a photograph from their ranch. This is one of their goats, Tarragon, resting with her new kid, not child, actual kid, goat, on one of their dogs called Pierre. Why do the goats and the dog have such an obvious, as you see in this photograph, strong emotional bonds? Simply because Pierre was put in the goat barn when he was a puppy. And so he grew up around goats, and he looks for goats to form emotional bonds with as life goes on. And it seems to have been reciprocated by the goats. That I included because that's the example I've seen for myself. That's up here in the northeast of Arizona. I was rather hoping this year that I would get to Australia to see this, which is to my mind the single most amazing and cutest example of this type. This is a picture from an island off the south coast of Australia where dogs are put with penguins on the island to protect the penguins from foxes, which at certain times of year can make their way across to the island. And it's been tremendously successful. So that was one thing I want to leave you with. Dogs will care for anything that they're put with when they're young. It's not just us. And the other thing is a new experiment where we've been investigating how much dogs will do if they care about a person. And so this is an experiment where that dog's owner is in that box. She's crying out, help, help me. And we're interested to see how her dog reacts. And what we find is the dog shows many signs of distress. The dog is upset. And ultimately, ultimately, the dog will rescue her human from the box. So dogs have an exceptional capacity to form strong emotional bonds with members of other species. In other words, your dog really does love you. So thank you very much. I hope I've left a little time to answer a few questions.
Okay, Dr. Wynne, this is Nancy, and I've been looking for questions through here. One that came to me, I don't have any from people right now, and I'm hoping that they'll start coming in a moment. If you have any questions, please get them in our Q&A box. I know this is a lot. It's a lot to absorb, and it's not always easy to frame questions when we get this kind of information. But one that comes to me, sorry, whatever that came up. Anyway, what one that comes to me is, how does training, when you're doing a study or an experiment like the pointing experiment, how much does previous training affect that? Because very popular these days to train dogs to touch your hand, to follow your hand, to really get that focus. So when I point at an object, my dogs look at my hand.
Yeah, absolutely, Nancy. That's a great question. So I didn't go into this in a lot of detail in interest of time, but of course, you can, that last experiment I showed you where the dog is letting the person out of the box, it would be pretty trivial, really just 5 to 10 minutes work for a trainer to train the dog to open the box. And indeed, some dogs are trained to rescue people from different environments. So for our purposes, it was very important that we worked with dogs who had not been trained, because if they had already been trained, well, then the fact that they do what you want them to do is simply a direct consequence of the training. Now, with the following pointing gestures, again, some dogs, and it would again be trivially easy to train dogs to follow human pointing gestures. We intentionally worked with dogs that, to the best of our knowledge, had not been explicitly trained to follow human pointing gestures. That said, I think that the lives our dogs lead with us do, even if you know nothing about training, you have no plan to train your dog to do anything, nonetheless, the experiences that the dog has around you, living with you, they act like training experiences. A situation can have training impacts even if the people involved had no knowledge of training at all. Every time we feed our dogs by hand, we are making the movement of our arms and our hand into cues that predict something important to the dog. That is informal training. Every time you throw something, you are making this whole set of arm-hand movements predictive of where this desired object is going to end up. And so you are, in effect, training the dog to pay attention to what you do. And we know this in part because we also tested dogs at an animal shelter. And we found the dogs living in the animal shelter, most of them did not spontaneously follow human pointing gestures. presumably because they've been living in kennels for some months and hadn't had a lot of recent relevant experience of what people's movements might mean. So they did not spontaneously follow human pointing gestures. We then did an experiment to train them to follow pointing gestures. And on average, you can teach your dog to follow a gesture in about 10 minutes.
Mhm. I agree with that, being a trainer. But so I have a couple of other questions now coming in from our audience. I'll connect two of them. So does the gender or the age of a dog affect your studies? Are they all in the same age range, or do you find this over ages and genders?
So those are great questions. We have ourselves never spotted any gender effects. That said, it should be kept in mind that from the point of view of the hormonal profile of the animal, there are in fact functionally 4 genders or sexes in dogs, not just 2, because you have male and female, and you also have sterilized males and females. Each of those 4 is going to have a different hormonal profile. But as I say, it's not something that we've studied. It would take larger whatever differences there are must be subtle, because we always have that information. We've never noticed anything in our studies, which makes me think that any differences must be small and subtle, and it would take a big set of animals to be able to test it. Age must play a role. We've never studied age on any of the studies I described to you, but we have been doing studies on the effect of age on memory and on attention. And age definitely has an impact on both of those things in the way you'd expect, that as dogs get older, their memory and their ability to concentrate, to pay attention, declines. But that said, I'd like to point out, yes, you can teach an old dog new tricks. It may take a little longer. And of course, your old dog, even if the old dog is mentally fully fit, is still going to get tired sooner and may have difficulty hearing, seeing. So you need to be patient with your old dog, but you can teach an old dog new tricks.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into our next question, which really probably has a really broad range of answers. But what about our rescue dogs that are rehomed? How does their prior experience affect their ability to bond and to love their new humans?
So Nancy, I'm so glad that question came up, because I actually usually try and remember to say something about this without having to be nudged. So our dogs form strong bonds with people. And those bonds that they form with us are similar to the kinds of bonds that we seek in our social companions, in our love for our children, for our spouses, and for our friends. There's a similarity there. How dogs look for loving relationships, how people look for loving relationships. And that, of course, is why we share such rich lives together, precisely because there's enough similarity that we can form these bonds, but they're not identical. They're not identical, and they differ in an important respect. And that is that although our dogs form powerful bonds with their people, and I want to say sincere bonds with their people, nonetheless, dogs are able, on average, because there's varieties, each dog is an individual, on average, dogs do move on more readily, and they do form new relationships more readily. So I know that there are people who are nervous about adopting an adult dog from a shelter or from any other circumstance, because they worry that the adult dog already has, too many miles on them, that they're going to have difficulty forming a strong bond in a new family. And on average, that's not true. Unlike in our own species, where losing one family is a blow from which a child might never fully psychologically recover, dogs do recover and they do move on. Now, I so wish that I had had this in mind from a scientific point of view when we adopted our Zephos. She was 1 year old when we got her. And it was apparent when and she had lived in a different human home before. And it was apparent when we first got her that she was disoriented and frightened and confused. And I so wish I had studied it from a scientific point of view, because all I can now say is that it's my feeling that it took her about 3 weeks to settle in. certainly by the end of a month, if you came and visited us, you would never have guessed that she had ever lived in a different human home because she was so embedded in our home. So I think it's important people realize that dogs can and do move on in life and form strong new connections. It isn't to say that there isn't some trauma for them in making that change, but they do recover. And it is definitely a fine thing to choose a dog, an adult dog from a shelter. They will come to love you very quickly.
Yeah. And it's so good to know that, those of us in the rescue community. I have another question. There are a couple more here. Do you think the pandemic is going to cause our dogs to be sad and need anything when we go back to work? I worry that all this time together is making my dog even more dependent on my attention.
Well, I think Nancy, that is a legitimate worry, and that people who are presently at home and will have to go back to a more regular 9 to 5 existence away from home need to think about this. And it sounds perverse, it sounds perhaps stupid, but I think we have to gentle our dogs into it. Dogs are adaptable beings. As I already said, they can adapt to living in new families, they can adapt to changes in their lives, but we need to give them a chance to get used to things. So I think we need to start going out without them just for practice and start small, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, work up so that your dog gets used to the idea that you go away, but you always come back, and you go away and come back at unpredictable times, and that's okay. You will be coming back. I think that's what we need to do. We need to gentle our dogs back into these other rhythms that will surely come
Yes, and we
back.
hope we're all doing that. I one last question is, are there any interesting studies in progress that are counter to what you're discovering, that they're discovering anything different?
Discover well. So the people who think that there's something special about the intelligence of dogs rather than the affectionate nature of dogs, they continue doing experiments, which they continue to say suggest there's something special to the intelligence of dogs. Um, I, and good for them. I don't think anybody would want to argue that dogs do not have a remarkable capacity for forming affectionate bonds. I think the area where, if I'm being invited to criticize myself, the area where my position is weakest is when I say that this is unique to dogs. Because it's not like we've done a heck of a lot of research on other species, right? I mean, it aligns with most people's intuitions that dogs show more loving behavior than, say, cats on average. I know there are very loving cats, but on average, most people think dogs are more loving on average than cats, and that dogs and cats are more loving than wild animals. But apart from our studies on the wolves, there are not many studies looking at the capacity of animals to form affectionate bonds with members of other species. I mean, you could say you saw that photograph of the goats, right? I mean, the goats seem just as loving towards the dog as the dog towards the goats. Maybe I should go back out there to their ranch and start doing some studies on the emotional bonds of the goats. If I'm going to claim that dogs are special, I probably need to collect more evidence that other animals cannot show this kind of thing.
Okay,
So
there's one other question came in. When you were studying the genetic aspects of this, did did you look at human directed aggression and what sort of genetics are involved in that?
I have not. I have not. Now, on the one hand, I think all of us who love dogs mustn't sweep the negative side of the relationship under the carpet. I think that we owe it to the world of people uh, to be aware of the fact that dogs do sometimes harm people. That there is a negative side to the fact that we live with dogs. That said, I find it such a horrible thing to think about that I'm reluctant to study it. There have been attempts to look at the genetics of aggression in dogs, but my understanding is that that people who love dogs are not as enthusiastic to help with that research. So there was a research program on rage in English Springer Spaniels.
Yeah.
And it was a geneticist group, and they were looking for the genes in this syndrome. But my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the Springer Spaniel community became very, very upset as it was made public that this was such a widespread problem, and that they withdrew their cooperation in the research, which is, I think, a hell of a shame, because I think if we could figure these things out, we could find ways of reducing the problem. And I think that that's something we owe it to our fellow human beings to maximize the positives in our relationships with dogs, and also to minimize the negatives. I don't think we should shy away from that.
Okay, so we like to emphasize the positive as well, because we're in the business of rehoming all of these loving animals, and so the really major part of them are major number of them are totally successful. So I'm going to remind people that you have a book available called Dog is Love, available from Dogwise and probably Amazon and many other sources. Would be a very interesting read. And I'm going to turn it back over to Morgan to close up the program. And we thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun.
Great. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I had an amazing time. I think I learned so much, and the questions were just fabulous. And we will be in, just about an hour doing toys and games that you can play with your dogs. So if you can hop on that, do. And this will conclude our webinar. Thank you so much, everybody.